Tripod, the official Trinity University Press podcast, invites authors, journalists, community leaders, and other guests to engage in exploratory, informative discussions on the subjects of people, places, and the planet. I'm Lily Brennan, and welcome back to another episode of Tripod, the official podcast of the Trinity University Press. Joining me today is Kurt Caswell, a professor of creative writing and literature in the Honors College at Texas Tech University, and author of several books, including the Trinity University Press title, Iceland Summer, Travels Along the Ring Road. Kurt is here to discuss his many adventures in Iceland and the lessons he learned along the way that can help us all rediscover our communities, place, and feel inspired to adventure into our world. Welcome, Kurt Caswell.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, obviously, this is our first time meeting, and any listeners, this might be their first time meeting you as well. Do you want to give just a brief introduction to yourself?
I'm Kurt Caswell. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. Through my undergraduate years, I decided that I needed to travel to maybe make that dream of becoming a writer come true. And so I had always grown up as a traveler. And so I started traveling and writing, and that led me into teaching, which after a number of different teaching jobs, I came here to Texas Tech University, and I've been here for a good 20 years.
That's incredible. I love hearing that people, take that time to go out and travel and then come back to sort of find the career or the job, the interest that they've been sort of trying to approach. But in researching you and your career for this episode, I learned that you're not only in Texas Tech as a professor, but that you've been a professor in Japan, Navajo Reservation, and some other colleges in the States. Have you always wanted to teach? And were there any experiences at those other schools that really stick out to you?
Actually, I didn't want to teach. When I was in undergrad, my plan was to become a writer, and I didn't really know what that meant or how I would do that and make a living. But that was my goal, and initially, I bought into that idea that those who can do and those who can't teach. But then I found that teaching was a really good way to travel and to be fairly mobile. I know some teachers find it a sedentary or a job in which you find your place and then you stay there. But I found that there are teaching positions, there are schools all over the world. There are international schools. There's a system of private schools all over the United States. And that as a teacher, I could, kind of move from school to school, from situation to situation. The job in Japan that was my first real teaching job.
That's so interesting. I mean, to have teaching in Japan as your first teaching experience, that sounds really, I don't know, was it intimidating to have that be, a cross-country experience as your first teaching job?
It was because I had never been in the classroom before. And, the work I was doing there was in a private language school, primarily focused on speaking the English language. So students would come to practice, the more formal English that they had learned in a classroom, either in the public schools or in university. Mm-hmm. And my job was really to get them to speak. So it was intimidating in the sense that I didn't know what I was doing in the classroom, and I just sort of arrived there and was thrust into a room with some students, and they were like, have fun. So I had to figure it out. It was a little bit trial by fire, but it got better and better as I learned. So you've been teaching creative writing at Texas Tech. Is there something you really enjoy about creative writing teaching? I teach in the Honors College. So honors students don't tend to be English majors or interested in creative writing as a career path or a academic path. So there are a lot of engineering students, a lot of pre-med students, and a lot of pre-law students. And they tend to be very good at writing, but it's not their primary focus. So one of the things I love about where I am and what I'm doing is, they come to the creative writing classroom with really an interest in improvement. And they also want a class that maybe focuses a little bit on their own lives, right? To make their own lives important. And they find that, I think, deeply engaging and refreshing in many ways. That's inspiring for me because I'm a creative writing minor.
but my major was always communications. And now I'm obviously doing the podcast and stuff and other marketing related communications positions.
Hmm.
But finding time to still write creatively and writing fiction is definitely difficult. It's nice to know that there are other young professionals who are still trying to write and work at the same time, and that you can do more than one of those things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would like to talk a bit about Iceland Summer, and if you could give a brief summary of that book, that'd be a good place to start, I think.
Well, Iceland Summer is call it an illustrated travelogue or travel narrative. It tells the story of about a 6-week journey that I made in Iceland with a very close friend of mine from high school. You know, I went to Iceland with some pretty specific interests in the Icelandic sagas and in Norse mythology and stories. You know, Iceland is a nation of the book, and it is a highly literate nation that supports, you know, a great number of writers who are writing in Icelandic with a very small population of people. So it's a fascinating country in many ways, and it's also a very wild place. And so I did go and investigate and explore Icelandic sagas and saga sites, but eventually the book became much more about friendship, and it's really the story of how to travel with a friend, you know, and the way in which that pairing can bring a journey to life.
I think that's a great way to explain sort of the metamorphosis that's like within the book, because it definitely starts out as very travel focused and a lot about the many awesome experiences that you have in Iceland. But specifically, I just wanted to get back slightly on the illustrated aspect of the book. What made you want to make it an illustrated travel log rather than just, you know, a nonfiction piece?
Well, I have long admired illustrated books. And, you know, for a while I was trying my hand at writing something like Where the Wild Things Are, you know,
Yeah.
an illustrated book for a much younger audience,
Hmm.
which to me meant, you know, the language was very spare and the illustrations had to say a great deal, as at least as much as the words were saying.
Yeah.
And so I loved that pairing, and the thought about working with an artist who might read something I had written and then bring that to life on the page seemed to me pretty exciting. And I thought, what does this story need that it doesn't have? And that's when I thought, well, naturally, maybe I will be able to fulfill this dream of working with an artist and having a book illustrated. So that's where that came from.
I think that's a great question to ask throughout the writing process of what does this book need? I hadn't thought about that question before, but anytime I'm reading a travel piece, especially with this one, I don't have a good conception of Iceland. And I think very few Americans do have a good conception of Iceland. So seeing these images and bringing out the colors and the vibrancy was really helpful to me. And because you discuss so many mythical things and things that you don't necessarily see with your eyes, but you've imagined in your head, and those get brought alive on the page as well. I think that was really fun. And it made me curious if you had a favorite illustration from the book.
Well, maybe a couple. You know, one of my favorite is certainly the illustration that's on the cover.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
it's a big double page spread, you know, with me and my traveling companion Scott sitting on the edge of this lake waiting for, you know, the Icelandic version of the Loch Ness Monster, because there's this very old story about that lake. And obviously, when you see the illustration, you'll see that we did meet and find that monster came right out of the lake. I think another favorite is the illustration of Scott lying on the ground out there in the Hornstrander Peninsula, sort of with his eyes closed. He looks like he's passed out, you know, from too much drink. But I love that image because it just says something a little bit about that very spare and wild landscape next to, I suppose, the kind of peacefulness but also exhaustion of backcountry travel, you know, in a place like that.
What was the writing process of this book like? Was there journaling that was going on? And then how did the process of working with an illustrator go?
I kept a very detailed journal when I was in Iceland, and you know, in the summertime in Iceland, there's pretty much all night or 24 hours of light. So it's a place where you have to become a little accustomed to keeping your own hours and thinking, okay, well, it's midnight, but it looks like it's actually noon. That did afford some benefits in that when we were like pinned down in some bad weather and there's a lot of wind flapping the tent, and if I was awake, I was probably working in the journal. And that led me to write down some things, for example, that Scott said word for word. So I had very good and detailed notes. In working with the illustrator, once I'd finished the manuscript, I just turned it over to her. We had a couple conversations where she asked a number of questions. She asked me for some photographs that I had taken, so that she could get a sense of the landscape and the places that I had been. And then she just started making art. She just started making illustrations, and she would give me a batch, of 5 or 10 and say, how do these look? What do you think of this? And I was able to give her a little feedback in the certain cases and say, well, I think that's not quite accurate because of, these details. And she would go back and revise. So that was a really fun process where she was responding to the work and I was responding to her work, and it was very organic and teamwork.
Enjoying this episode with Kurt Caswell? Check out his book Iceland Summer: Travels Along the Ring Road, and his other titles now available for purchase on the Trinity University Press website and anywhere you buy books. Use Tripod's discount code KURT20 to save 20% on your purchase of any of Kurt's titles at tupress.org. There are a lot of larger themes and questions that get brought out in the book. And I think a large part of how those come out is you travel on foot and by bus a lot on the book, rather than a lot of other Iceland travelers do not get that opportunity, because it's not necessarily, at least from reading, it was not the easiest terrain to travel. But you say that walking is a meditative and poetic practice essential to human health and happiness. Why do you think that is?
It's poetic in the sense that it brings all the parts of, what makes a human being function together, and it's freeing. I had a Shakespeare class last semester, and I had students memorizing passages from the plays we were reading and then reciting them in front of class. And they stand up, sort of inertly in front of the class and try to recite these lines. And I said to them, if we were out on a walk and you weren't so focused on, let's say, the formality of the classroom, and you were just walking along, you could probably recite these lines much more freely. And so the walk frees the mind. And when Scott and I were out walking, I found that we did our best thinking and talking.
I was curious if you had a favorite place that you walked to. You walked so many places, but was there a favorite thing that sticks out in your memory?
I would say the section which is documented in the book of walking in the Hornstrander. This is the far northwest corner of Iceland, a little peninsula that we accessed by a boat. And they dropped us off at one point, and we walked, 4 nights, 3 days around, and then the boat came back and picked us up on the other end. There were some other people out there, and so there was, help, I suppose, if we needed it. But we were very isolated and such a dramatic landscape. Like, you really did feel like Beowulf would come riding up over the hill, at any minute.
Yeah.
In the Hornstrander, we kept coming up over these mountaintops and then down the other side, and then over another one and down the other side. And there was one day in particular where we were crossing, this field of volcanic rock, and we're way up high, looking for our way down into this next fjord. And it was raining a little bit. The fog came in, and there's a series of cairns that you can use to navigate. But as that mist came in, our vision was really only roughly from one big pile of rocks to another. So we could see the cairn out in front of us. And while walking through that mist and seeing these odd rock formations, I thought, oh, this proves to me that trolls really do exist.
There was a lot of talk of trolls. I really liked that. But before even getting to the process of walking a place and enjoying it, you say there's some barriers to travel for people, which are fear and loneliness. How do you think people can overcome those barriers to really enjoy and remember a place?
I think one way you can do that is you go with a trusted friend. when you're traveling like that, and it could be anywhere, you could be traveling in a city, which is potentially a far more dangerous place than, a wild place off in Iceland somewhere. But I think if you do some good preparation, especially with reading and planning about the place that you're going, but then you go with somebody who you're willing to share whatever fate with, so if you get into trouble, the two of you have some skills to get out of trouble. And wherever that trouble leads, you're willing to go there with this friend.
But I think you have a unique perspective on loneliness or just, that kind of fear of being alone. You say loneliness helps awaken me to my surroundings and open me to people I might learn from. Do you have is there a reason why you've developed this opinion? And do you think others can do the same? Trinity University Press is a mission-driven publisher committed to civic engagement with timely ideas facilitated by the publication of print and digital books, related media, creative and educational programs, and other activities that help us all better understand our place in a crowded world. For more than 50 years, Trinity University Press has published more than 225 titles and organized thousands of events, all focused on broadening our understanding of many impactful subjects, from human relationships with our physical environments to social equity and justice. For more information about Trinity University Press, visit tupress.org.
Yeah, I mean, traveling alone is also a very, I think, useful skill, but also it's an important way to be in the world at least a few times in your life. You may want to travel mostly with other people or with a friend, but if you go out and travel alone, you're much more open and porous in taking on new ideas, new information. You're much more aware of your surroundings because you're the only one with you. You can't sort of bury your face in your phone and go to a different world. You're kind of always checking about yourself. So when I was in my early 20s and just out of undergrad school, I took this trip to Europe like a lot of people do, and with the backpack and the Eurail pass. And I was on a ferry coming from Greece back to Italy. This group of about 4 or 5 also students walked up. They were my age, and they walked up to me, and one of them said, "Would you like some chocolate?" I said, "Oh no," because I was thinking, are these people here to take something from me? Do they want something?
Like what's in
Or
the
are they
chocolate?
being friendly? You don't know.
Yeah.
So you're kind of, it's a series of tests, and eventually I figured out, okay, I think these people are honest. And so then I finally said yes. And they all sat down, and then we had a great time. And the rest of the ferry trip, which was about another 12 hours or so, I hung out with this group of people and we became great friends. And then I went back and visited them in their hometown in Italy. Mm-hmm. And they showed me around and put me up. And so when you're traveling alone, sometimes the best adventures unfold because you're open to it. You need friends, you need help, you need guidance.
One of the questions you ask on the journey is, who will I become where I'm going that suits me better than who I am now? I felt like an undergrad student or somebody who just wanted to get a break from school to really reconnect with their goals for themselves and their life. Do you think that's a question worth asking still when going on solo adventures?
Even when going on adventures with or journeys with other people, that there are sometimes subtle changes that you are undergoing when you're traveling, and you may be unaware of them. You come through an experience and you come back home, and there's just something slightly different about you than when you left, right? And you've got new experience and you know things about the world that you didn't know before. It's kind of opened you up in a new way, and I think that's a key to the benefits of travel. When you strike out on the road and you make yourself sort of vulnerable and open to new experiences and new people and new cultures, new language, new food, it changes you for the better.
I absolutely agree. I feel like I'm quoting you all the time, but this is actually a quote from Paul Thoreau that you mentioned of just, I can't make my days longer, so I strive to make them better. For those where traveling is not as accessible, do you think we can still have the power to make our days better or more full of adventure?
I think what a person can do, even if they're just going to work and coming home, is that they can just basically pay attention, in the same way that you are awakened to, your everyday life while you're traveling. You're much more attentive and alive in many ways because you're going and doing and seeing. You can treat your everyday life in the same way. For a writer can be, I think you can exercise that by just telling yourself, when I step out the door, I should pay attention to what's around me. I should bring a notebook and take notes on what I see and what I experience. Because sometimes what you're doing is just passing by story after story after story because it becomes routine. And you think, well, I've seen this 100 times, and so I don't need to pay attention. And you're really checked out of your own life. But there is something happening around you all the time. If you're aware, I think you can make your days better.
Because I'm gonna move on to some questions related to place and how we can, engage better with our own places through this journey that you had with Iceland. I feel like when I go on trips, or even just like in my day to day, I take a lot of pictures of food, but I
Hmm.
think writing does so much justice to how something actually tastes or the experience that you had. And you definitely try some interesting foods in Iceland, like puffin and some
Yeah.
very good hot dogs. How do you think the food helps you sort of explore Iceland, and how does food really represent a place?
Yeah, food makes a place distinct, or a
Mhm.
place is distinct often through its food or its cuisine. It's one of the pieces that, so if we're talking about the how the senses come alive, it's easy to look out on a waterfall or something and say, isn't that beautiful? Or I hear the sound of this waterfall, but you rarely taste these experiences. And so in an odd way, it's like you're eating this culture
Yeah,
now instead instead of just listening to it or seeing
right.
it or sensing it in your nose and or speaking a language with someone. I think food is just a piece of that larger whole.
When I had no idea that, is it like the food of Iceland is hot dogs?
Yeah, they say the national food is the hot dog. Yeah.
I thought that was
Yeah.
so funny but the
Yeah.
way you describe it made me really want to eat a hot dog, but I feel like no hot dog in Texas could compare. It sounded so awesome. Having those experiences digitally, though it's great for accessibility and getting people to see new perspectives. And one of those experiences, I think, was visiting the house of that author. I can't remember. It was an
Yes.
Icelandic author, right?
Haldor Laxness.
Yes. What
Yeah.
was that experience like? And do you think, because you kind of battle about like, is it sort of morbid to walk through somebody's house, or is it okay?
Yeah.
Like, do you feel like you have more of an answer to that now?
We were the only ones in the house. I mean, it is a museum and there was somebody there at the door, of course, but we were the only ones visiting. Yeah, I did feel a little odd here was this is a person's home, like you're walking into their bathroom and
Yeah.
they're not there anymore and they haven't been for some time, but the house has been somewhat preserved in the state it was when Laxness died. There is an oddness to it, but at the same time, you benefit deeply from occupying a space that another person has occupied. So I can go read Haldor Laxness's books, or I can read a biography of his life, but you walk into somebody's house, just like a person or a friend of yours whose home you go to for the first time. You walk into their house and you say, oh, now I understand something about you that I didn't know
Right.
before.
Right.
Like this all makes sense.
But that made me ask, what would somebody learn about you as an author if your home was just kind of opened up?
Well, I think the first thing is, they would walk through and they would know what it is that I've read because there are books on the shelf, and that's one of the first things that I'm attracted to when I go to somebody's house. And they probably would see that I have been very careful to hopefully eliminate clutter, that it would be a very open and airy space.
I wrote that question down, and in doing so, I was like, I have no idea what somebody would learn about me, I guess, other than like similarly, I have my books all over the place. I rarely never have bare spaces on the wall. I almost always have my walls completely covered. I don't know if
Wow.
they would think I was a hoarder or if they would think I was like just somebody who likes art, but either
Yeah.
way, I couldn't help but think about that. And also, why do you think we find those places important or necessary to be preserved?
I think it demystifies a little bit the person when you walk into a space like that, and you realize what they achieved maybe is possible for others after.
I've never visited an author's home, but I do think where somebody chooses to make creative work and express
Yeah.
themselves, definitely it says a lot about who they are and what they think is important. But moving away from kind of people and places, I saw that your book had a lot of global connections, at least to me, but you share a different statistic than this, but essentially that 1 in 10 Icelanders will publish a book or, be a writer. I thought that was incredible and definitely
Mhm.
not something I think of when I think of the US, or even it's not something I think about with other countries. But what do you think makes Iceland so conducive for writers to be a place of writing?
They have this history that's focused on the Icelandic sagas. It was a place in the Middle Ages where books were being written and made. Middle Ages, the scholars of that time feeling compelled to, we need to write this down and preserve it. And so I think that's carried on, through their history as a culture. I don't know exactly what the population is right now, but somewhere around 350,000
Mhm.
people speak Icelandic. And you have these people who are writing in Icelandic. They're very successful as writers in their own country with a very small population. So it seems to me it's a country that just never let go of, let's say, their own language and expression in that language.
I liked the notion that even though you discuss world-ending things biologically, ecologically, and otherwise, and kind of feeling like that is something pressing on the world and the people in the world, but you also state that you can love a landscape when love is projected onto it. I think people right now maybe are struggling to love their places in the world or love what's going on in the world. But
Mm.
do you have any thoughts or advice on how people can project love on a landscape and maybe, make a difference in that way?
Yeah, I think engaging with that landscape is probably the key, right? The when we were talking a little bit before about the way you can make an ordinary day sort of special by just engaging with the day and saying, I have to, ride the bus or I have to go through this commute, but I'm going to use that to the best of my advantage. The best way to love a place, I think, is to participate in its story. And we do that by paying attention, getting outside and getting to know not just maybe our neighbors, but also what kind of plants and animals live in this landscape that I'm living in, whether it's urban or, rural.
I think that can apply, like, especially when stuff is difficult, times are stressful. It's like just taking that step back and being like, okay, I'm still part of this broader world, and it's still something that I need to take active steps to appreciate because it cares for me every day, whether it likes me or not. So
Yes,
I
yes.
liked that message of loving the landscape. But my last question I have is that you actually ask a few essential questions at the end of your book. Who am I? What do I mean in the world? What am I going to do? And with whom am I going to do it?
Yes, I think you find an answer, but the answer keeps changing, which is the reason that you keep asking, because it's like a call and response a little bit to you cast the question out and see what comes back. It is the most essential question is to figure out what it is you want to do with the time that you have.
Mhm.
And the other question is, who do you want to do it with? When you're asking that question, I think it's much more about, are you engaged in the answer, or are you just sort of letting
Like
the answer come to
passively.
you
Yeah.
passively? Yeah. Asking those questions of yourself, you may decide that, yes, I know who I am and where I'm going and what I want to do and who I'm going to do it with. And I've made all the right decisions. But if you come up against one of those and say, actually, I think I need to change something here, you can make your days better by more actively participating in the way they unfold.
Yeah, I think that's great and taking some agency to decide what you're going
Exactly.
to engage with and who you want to be, because you can change that every day and through
Yes.
every place you go to. Right.
So to ask that question, routinely, I think is a good practice.
Well, that was my last question, but thank you so much for making the time to be on the episode today.
Thanks so much for having me. This has been a delightful conversation.
Thank you for joining Kurt and I for another episode of exploring people, places, and our planet with Tripod. Come back soon.